Bloodstains don't wash out of silk, and weakness doesn't survive in this city. Dante Gallo knew both facts intimately, yet when his phone buzzed at 2 a.m, it wasn't a rival cartel or a corrupted judge on the line. It was his secretary, Chloe, a woman who organized his illegal empire with terrifying precision and a flawless blowout. But tonight she wasn't scheduling money laundering. She was whispering a plea that would burn his city to the ground. The bathroom tiles were freezing. Chloe Bishop sat on the floor, her knees pulled tight to her chest, the thin fabric of her evening dress offering zero protection against the damp, grimy grout. She stared at the crack running down the porcelain base of the toilet. It looked like a jagged little river. Her chest heaved, pulling in shallow, frantic breaths of air that smelled heavily of cheap cherry air freshener and old bleach. Outside the heavy wooden door, the bass from the club's sound system throbbed through the floorboards. It was a low, relentless vibration that rattled her teeth. But it wasn't the music she was listening for. It was the footsteps. "Come on, Chloe," a voice slurred from the hallway. A heavy fist pounded against the wood. Thud, thud, thud. "Don't be like that. We were having a good time. Open the door." Derek Walsh. He was supposed to be a blind date. A setup by an old college friend who thought Chloe worked too much. "He's in logistics," her friend had said. "He's stable. You need stable." What her friend didn't know, what Chloe hadn't realized until Derek had 3 scotches and started bragging about his recent acquisitions at the docks, was that Derek's logistics firm moved stolen pharmaceuticals for the Blake Syndicate. And the Blake Syndicate was currently in a quiet, bloody turf war with Chloe's employer. When Derek had casually dropped the name of her boss, his eyes tracking her reaction, a little too closely the cold reality had set in. He knew who she was. This wasn't a date. It was an interception. She had excused herself to the restroom, her heart pounding, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The doorknob rattled, violently. "Chloe." Derek's voice lost the faux friendly slur. It flattened into something hard and sober. "I know there's no window in there. Open the door before I get the bouncer to take it off the hinges. You really think they're going to stop me in this neighborhood?" He was right. This was a Blake-owned club. The police wouldn't come. If they did, they'd look the other way. Her pepper spray was in her purse, which she'd stupidly left at the table. Her hands shook as she unlocked her phone screen. The harsh glare of the backlight stung her eyes. She opened her contacts. She had the police. She had her sister in Ohio. She had a list of emergency fixers. And she had him, Dante. Just a first name. No last name. No title. In her contacts, he sat between her dentist and her dry cleaner. It was absurd. She pressed the call button before she could talk herself out of it. She pressed the speaker to her ear, squeezing her eyes shut. Ring, across the city in the basement of a meatpacking plant that smelled faintly of ammonia and raw beef, Dante Gallo sat at a steel table. He was a man composed entirely of hard angles and quiet violence. His tailored charcoal suit was immaculate, completely at odds with the concrete walls and the terrified man strapped to a chair across from him. Miles Dante's right hand leaned against the wall, inspecting his fingernails. Dante stared at the man in the chair. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Dante said. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It possessed a low, grinding gravity that commanded the room. "Where did the shipment go?" Before the man could stammer out another lie, Dante's phone vibrated in his breast pocket. He ignored it. Only 3 people had this number. 2 of them were in the room with him. The third never called outside of business hours unless the feds were kicking down the office doors. It vibrated again, sustained, urgent. Dante held up a hand, silencing the man in the chair mid-sob. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the phone. The screen illuminated the dim room. "Chloe." Dante frowned. He swiped the screen and brought the phone to his ear. "Speak." He expected a rapid-fire rundown of a crisis, warrants, subpoenas, a raid. Chloe was a machine. She didn't panic. She categorized. Instead, there was static. Then a sharp, ragged intake of breath. Dante. The single word froze the blood in his veins. It was a whisper. Frail. Trembling. It was a sound a wounded animal makes when the trap finally bites down to the bone. Dante stood up. The metal legs of his chair screeched against the concrete. Miles snapped to attention, his hand dropping instinctively to the holster at his waist. Chloe. Where are you? Dante's voice was completely flat, drained of any emotion, yet the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. A muffled thud echoed through the speaker. A voice yelled in the background. Chloe let out a tiny choked gasp. I'm at the Neon Lounge, on 4th and Pike, East Side. Who is with you? A guy, Derek Walsh. He works for the Blakes. Dante. I think he knows who I am. He knows I work for you. Her whisper grew more frantic, the words stumbling over each other. I'm locked in the bathroom. He's outside the door. He said he's going to take the hinges off. I didn't know who else to call. The cops won't come here. I'm sorry to bother you. I know you're working, but... Stop, Dante cut her off. Not out of anger, but to halt the spiral. Are you hurt? No, not yet. Are you alone in the room? Yes. Get into a stall. Lock it. Stand on the toilet so they can't see your feet under the door. Keep the phone on. Do not speak. Dante! Her voice broke. It was a tiny, devastating fracture. Can you please come get me? The absolute terror in that request, the raw, unfiltered dependency, hit Dante like a physical blow to the chest. Chloe never asked for help. She was the one who fixed things. She handled his life, his schedules, his chaos. To hear her beg to hear her, reduced to a terrified whisper, ignited a dark, ugly fire in the pit of his stomach. I'm already out the door, Dante said. He didn't hang up. He lowered the phone, slipping it into his pocket, so the line remained open. He looked at Miles. Get the car. Boss, we ain't done here, Miles protested, gesturing to the bleeding man in the chair. He's about to crack. Dante didn't look at the man in the chair. He didn't care about the shipment anymore. He didn't care about the money. Shoot him, Dante said, his tone casual, as if asking Miles to turn off the lights. We're leaving. He didn't wait to see it done. He was already walking up the concrete stairs, his heavy strides echoing in the stairwell. A second later, a muffled gunshot thumped from the basement. Dante didn't flinch. His mind was entirely focused on the sound of Chloe's ragged breathing coming from the speaker in his pocket. The rain started as soon as Dante pushed through the heavy steel doors of the meatpacking plant. It wasn't a gentle drizzle. It was a relentless driving downpour that turned the city streets into slick black mirrors, reflecting the bleeding neon of the streetlights. Miles pulled the black SUV around the tires, hissing against the wet asphalt. Dante didn't wait for him to park. He ripped the driver's side door open. I'm driving, Dante ordered. Miles took one look at Dante's face and didn't argue. He scrambled over the center console into the passenger seat. Dante slid behind the wheel, throwing the massive vehicle into gear before his door was even fully shut. The engine roared a deep, guttural sound that matched the violent churn in Dante's chest. He slammed his foot on the accelerator. The SUV fishtailed for a fraction of a second before the heavy tires gripped the road, launching them forward into the dark. Where are we going? Miles asked, grabbing the handle above the door as Dante swerved violently to avoid a slow-moving delivery truck. 4th and Pike, Dante said. Miles swore under his breath. The Neon Lounge, boss, that's heavy Blake territory. We go in there without a crew, it's a declaration of war. We need to call the boys. Get a couple of cars to back us up. There's no time. What's the play? Who's at the lounge? Chloe. Miles went completely silent. He stared at the side of Dante's face, processing the information. Everyone in the organization knew Chloe. She was untouchable, not just because she was Dante's secretary, but because she was the civilian beating heart of the office. She brought in decent coffee. She remembered birthdays. She handled the terrifying, blood-soaked men who worked for Dante with the polite, firm authority of a kindergarten teacher managing unruly toddlers. To the men she was a mascot. To Dante she was something else entirely, something he vehemently refused to examine. Dante pushed the SUV to 80 down a residential street, blasting through a red light. Horns blared in his wake, fading instantly as he kept accelerating. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, putting it on the dashboard mount. The call time ticked steadily upward. 2:14. 2:15. He could hear the thumping bass of the club through the tiny speaker. And underneath it, the sound of wood splintering. "Chloe," Dante barked, unable to stop himself. "Talk to me." There was a muffled gasp. He's kicking the outer door. It's cracking." Her whisper was barely audible over the noise. "Dante, it's taking too long. I am 4 minutes away. I need you to breathe. Just breathe, Chloe." Dante's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The leather creaked under his grip. He stared through the windshield, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the rain. He hated this city. He hated the filth, the constant maneuvering, the endless cycle of violence. He had built his empire on ruthlessness, on viewing people as assets or obstacles. There was no room for sentimentality. Sentimentality got you killed. But Chloe was the exception. He remembered her interview 3 years ago. She had walked into his office, a fresh-faced 24-year-old with a resume full of corporate internships. She wore a cheap navy suit and carried a binder. Dante had intended to scare her off in 5 minutes. His business wasn't for civilians. During the interview, one of his captains had burst into the room bleeding from a superficial graze on his arm, cursing loudly about a deal gone wrong. Dante had waited for the girl to scream, to run, to threaten, to call the police. Instead, Chloe had calmly reached into her oversized tote bag, pulled out a small first aid kit, and handed a gauze pad to the bleeding mobster. Apply pressure, she had instructed mildly. Then she turned back to Dante, adjusted her glasses and asked, "Regarding the 401k, matching, is there a vesting period?" He hired her on the spot. Over the years, she became the anchor to his sanity. She never asked what was in the duffel bags. She never questioned the burn phones. But she made sure he ate. She forced him to sign paperwork. She treated him not as a terrifying syndicate boss, but as an infuriatingly disorganized executive. She was the only clean thing in his orbit. The only person who looked at him without fear or greed. And now, because of his world, she was trapped in a filthy bathroom, listening to a man try to break down a door to get to her. The guilt tasted like battery acid in his throat. Crack! The sound came sharply through the phone speaker. It wasn't the heavy outer door anymore. It was closer. "He's inside," Chloe whispered. Her voice was a thin, trembling thread. "He's in the bathroom. He's checking the stalls." Dante pressed the accelerator to the floor. The SUV roared past the darkened storefronts of the east side. 3 blocks away. "Chloe, listen to me," Dante said. His voice was a low, commanding rumble. He needed to keep her focused. He needed to keep her from breaking. "If he opens that stall door, you do not fight him. Do you understand? You let him grab you. You go limp. You make yourself heavy. Buy me seconds. I'm scared. I know you are." It was the most vulnerable thing he had ever said to another human being. "I'm almost there. Keep your head down." The neon signs of 4th and Pike bled through the rain-streaked windshield. The neon lounge sat on the corner, a dilapidated brick building with a sputtering pink sign. A line of cars was parked haphazardly out front. 2 massive bouncers stood under the awning smoking. Dante didn't look for parking. He swerved across 2 lanes of traffic, jumped the curb and slammed the heavy front bumper of the SUV directly into the metal barricades near the entrance. The impact sounded like a bomb going off. The bouncers scrambled back, dropping their cigarettes, reaching into their jackets. Dante threw the car into park and kicked his door open. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. He moved with a terrifying singular purpose. "Stay with the car," Dante ordered Miles. "Boss, there's a dozen guys in there." Dante didn't answer. He was already walking through the rain, his soaked suit clinging to his heavy frame. He was a force of nature entirely consumed by the violent need to rip the world apart until she was safe. The bouncers recovered quickly. The larger of the two, a man with a thick neck and tribal tattoos crawling up his jawline, stepped into Dante's path. "Hey, crazy bastard, you can't park." Dante didn't slow down. He didn't even break his stride. He stepped inside the man's guard, grabbed him by the throat and the belt, and used his own momentum to heave the massive bouncer head first into the brick wall. The sickening crunch of bone against stone was drowned out by the thunder overhead. The man crumpled in a heap. The second bouncer froze his hand half drawn from his jacket, his eyes wide as he recognized the man walking toward him. "Dante Gallo," the bouncer breathed. "Where are the bathrooms?" Dante stated. It wasn't a question. "Back, down the hall, left." Dante walked past him, pushing open the heavy, soundproofed double doors of the club. The noise hit him like a physical wave. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, spilled gin, and synthetic fog. Strobe lights sliced through the darkness, illuminating hundreds of writhing bodies. It was disorienting, chaotic, a nightmare of sensory overload. Dante ignored it all. He moved through the crowd like a shark through a school of fish. He shoved people aside, his hands gripping shoulders and throwing them out of his path. Angry shouts followed him, but one look at his face, the dead, hollowed-out fury in his eyes, silenced them instantly. He found the hallway. It was darker here, the music muffled by the walls. At the end of the hall, the door to the women's restroom was hanging off its hinges, the wood splintered around the lock. Dante felt the rage curdle into something cold and absolute. He stepped over the debris. The bathroom was poorly lit, the fluorescent tubes overhead, flickering and buzzing. 3 stalls lined the wall. The first 2 doors were wide open. The third door was shut. Derek Walsh stood in front of it. Derek was a solidly built man in his 30s, wearing a tailored shirt that was now untucked and wrinkled. He was holding a heavy steel trash can, preparing to smash it against the lock of the closed stall. "Come on out, sweetheart," Derek grunted, raising the can. "You're just making this embarrassing." "Put it down." Dante's voice wasn't loud. It didn't boom over the thumping bass from the club, but it cut through the air with the lethal precision of a straight razor. Derek froze. He slowly lowered the trash can, turning around. When he saw Dante standing in the doorway, a drenched, immaculate angel of death, the color drained completely from his face. "Gallo," Derek stammered. He took a step back, hitting the stall door. The liquid courage he'd consumed earlier vanished instantly. "Look, man, this isn't what it looks like. We were just having a drink, a misunderstanding." Dante walked slowly toward him. The water dripped from the hem of his suit jacket onto the filthy tiles. "Drip, drip. She told you to stop," Dante said calmly. "I didn't lay a hand on her." Derek held his hands up, backing against the metal partition. "I swear to God, Gallo, I didn't touch her. I just wanted to talk. Just a little leverage, you know. Just business." "Business." Dante tested the word on his tongue. He stopped 2 feet away from Derek. "Yeah, just business." Derek tried a weak smile. Dante's fist snapped forward. He didn't wind up. He didn't telegraph it. It was a piston of pure kinetic energy. His knuckles collided with the center of Derek's face. The impact was wet and heavy. Derek's nose shattered instantly, a spray of dark blood splashing against the beige tiles. Derek screamed a high, reedy sound, clapping his hands over his face as he collapsed to his knees. Dante didn't stop. He grabbed a fistful of Derek's hair, yanking his head back, exposing his throat. He brought his knee up, driving it with horrifying force into Derek's jaw. The bone snapped with a loud crack that echoed in the small tiled room. Derek went entirely limp, slumping to the floor in a puddle of dirty water and his own blood. Dante stood over him, his chest rising and falling slowly. He looked down at his knuckles. The skin was split, bleeding sluggishly. He didn't feel the pain. He didn't feel anything except the hollow, echoing silence that had fallen over the room. He turned toward the locked stall. His breathing slowed. The monster receded, buried back beneath the tailored suit and the expensive watch. He wiped the blood from his hand onto his trousers. "Chloe," he said softly. Silence. "Chloe, it's me. It's over. He's asleep." There was a hesitant scrape of a shoe against porcelain. Then the slide of the deadbolt. The stall door clicked and swung open an inch. Dante pushed it the rest of the way. She was standing on the toilet lid, just as he had instructed. She looked so incredibly small. Her dark hair, usually pinned up in a pristine knot, was a mess falling around her face. Her makeup was smudged under her eyes. She was holding her phone in a death grip against her chest, her knuckles white. When she saw him, the last remnants of her composure fractured. She didn't say anything. She just dropped her phone into the toilet bowl with a soft plop, stepped down from the rim, and threw herself at him. Dante caught her. He stumbled back a half step, under her momentum. Her arms wrapped around his waist, her face buried into his soaked chest. She was trembling so violently, it felt like she was vibrating. She gripped his jacket, as if it were the only solid thing left in the universe. Dante froze. He was unaccustomed to comfort. He was unaccustomed to being touched by anyone who didn't want something from him, or wasn't trying to kill him. His hands hovered awkwardly in the air for a long second. Then slowly, carefully, he brought his arms down, wrapping them around her shoulders. He pulled her flush against him, tucking her head under his chin. He ignored the dampness of his clothes. He ignored the blood on his hands. He just held her. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice rumbling deep in his chest. "I've got you. You're safe." A dry sob hitched in her throat. "He knew my name, Dante. He knew about the office. I know. It's handled. Nobody is ever going to look at you again." He held her until the trembling began to subside. The club music still pounded outside a distant, irrelevant noise. Inside this ruined, filthy bathroom, there was only the sound of her breathing, evening out against his collarbone. Eventually, Chloe pulled back. She looked down at the unconscious, bleeding man on the floor, then up at Dante's bruised knuckles. She didn't flinch. She just reached into her small clutch purse, which somehow she had managed to hold on to, and pulled out a clean, folded white handkerchief. She took his hand. Her fingers were cold against his. Carefully she wiped the blood from his knuckles. "You ruined your suit," she whispered, her voice still rough, but regaining a fraction of its usual clinical calm. Dante looked at her. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her dress wrinkled, yet she was still trying to fix him. A sudden, overwhelming surge of affection tightened his chest, a feeling so foreign and intense it terrified him more than any gun barrel ever could. "I have others," he said. He took his jacket off and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy, smelling of rain and expensive cologne swallowing her small frame. "Let's go home, Chloe." He kept his hand on the small of her back as he guided her out of the bathroom, stepping over Derek's limp body without a second glance. The boundary between them, the clean, professional line that had kept him sane for 3 years, had just been obliterated. Dante knew things would never be the same when they walked back into the office on Monday. And as he led her out into the cold, pouring rain toward the waiting SUV, he realized he didn't want them to be. The heater in the SUV blasted dry, scorching air, but Chloe couldn't stop shivering. She sat in the back seat, dwarfed by Dante's soaked suit jacket, her knees pressed tightly together. The adrenaline crash was brutal. It left her feeling hollowed out, her bones vibrating with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Dante sat beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't crowd her. But the heat radiating off his body was a gravitational pull. Up front, Miles drove with white-knuckled intensity. The silence in the car was heavy thick with the unsaid reality of what had just occurred. A boss didn't abandon an interrogation assault, a made man in a rival club, and start a gang war over a secretary. It defied the fundamental arithmetic of their world. Chloe stared at the blurry streetlights streaking across the tinted window. "My apartment is on 84th, she said. Her voice sounded like crushed glass. "We aren't going to your apartment," Dante replied. He didn't turn his head. He watched the rearview mirror with predatory focus. She turned to look at him. The streetlights washed over the harsh angles of his face, illuminating the darkening bruise blooming across his cheekbone, where Derek had managed a lucky, desperate swing before his jaw was broken. "Dante, I have to go home. I have work tomorrow." It was a stupid thing to say. Absurd. But her brain was desperately clawing for the mundane, for the spreadsheets and calendar invites that made up her safe, predictable reality. Dante finally looked at her. The lethal emptiness that had been in his eyes inside the club was gone, replaced by a heavy, exhaustingly human exhaustion. "Derek knows where you live, Chloe. The Blakes know. By morning, they'll realize what happened. Your apartment is compromised. You stay with me until I clean this up." She wanted to argue. She wanted to demand her independence. But the memory of Derek's heavy fist against the bathroom door paralyzed her vocal cords. She nodded once, pulling the lapels of his jacket tighter around her neck. It smelled like gunpowder, expensive wool and rain. It smelled terrifyingly safe. Dante's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a high-rise downtown. Chloe had managed the property taxes and the HOA fees for 3 years, but she had never stepped foot inside. When the private elevator door slid open, she expected opulence. Gold-trim marble, the gaudy trappings of illicit wealth. Instead, she stepped into a fortress of brutalist minimalism. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the storm-battered city, but the glass was thick, tinted bulletproof. The furniture was dark leather and cold steel. There were no photographs, no art. It looked less like a home and more like a beautifully furnished waiting room. "Miles," Dante said as they stepped inside. "Set up a perimeter. I want 2 men in the lobby, 2 in the garage. Call Donovan. Tell him to wake up the crew. Nobody sleeps tonight." "Boss." Miles nodded, pulling his phone to his ear as he backed into the elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing them in. Dante turned to her. He suddenly looked entirely out of his depth. The ruthless mob boss who had shattered a man's face 20 minutes ago was standing in his living room, dripping wet, staring at his secretary, as if she were an unexploded bomb. "There's a guest room down the hall," he said, gesturing vaguely. "First door on the right. It has a bathroom. Towels are in the cabinet." Chloe stood on the pristine hardwood floor, acutely aware of the dirty club water dripping from her heels. She slipped her shoes off. "Thank you." She walked toward the hallway. Her legs felt like lead. She stopped at the doorway, her hand resting on the smooth wood of the frame. She looked back over her shoulder. Dante hadn't moved. He was watching her, his jaw tight, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. The split skin on his knuckles was bleeding again, slow red drops falling onto the floor. The professional boundary between them was a smoldering crater. She knew she shouldn't cross it completely. She knew she should walk into the guest room, lock the door, and pretend this was just another HR crisis. But she remembered the terrifying warmth of his arms around her in that filthy bathroom. Chloe dropped her clutch purse on a side table. She walked back to him. Dante went perfectly still as she approached. She didn't say a word. She reached out, took his heavy wrist and led him toward the kitchen. The kitchen island was a massive slab of black granite. She guided him to the sink and turned on the faucet. "Hold your hands under," she ordered gently. Dante obeyed. The warm water washed away the drying blood, swirling pink down the stainless steel drain. Chloe found a dish towel, clean and stiff with lack of use. She took his hands, drying them with meticulous care. His hands were massive, calloused, scarred. Tools of violence. Yet as she pressed the towel against his knuckles, he kept his fingers completely relaxed, yielding entirely to her touch. "It hurts?" she asked softly. "No." He lied. His voice was a low rumble. He wasn't looking at his hands. He was looking at the top of her head. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, keeping her eyes fixed on the dish towel. "You risked everything. Your territory, your business." "For me." Dante stepped closer. The distance between them evaporated. He reached out with his injured hand, hooking a single finger under her chin and lifting her face until she was forced to look at him. "There is no business without you, Chloe," he said. The absolute certainty in his voice sent a shockwave straight down her spine. "I would burn the entire city to ash before I let anyone put their hands on you. Do you understand?" She stared into his dark eyes. There was no hesitation, no regret. Just a terrifying, possessive devotion that she had been too blind or too professional to see for 3 years. "I understand," she breathed. Dante's thumb brushed lightly over her cheekbone, wiping away a smear of ruined mascara. His touch was feather-light, a jarring contrast to the violence he was capable of. "Go shower, lock the door, try to sleep." He dropped his hand and stepped back. The cold air rushed into the space between them. Chloe nodded, turning toward the hallway, her heart hammering a frantic, newly awakened rhythm against her ribs. Morning broke over the city like a bruise. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky the color of dirty iron. Chloe woke up in the guest room. The bed was enormous, the sheets a high thread count that felt like water against her skin. She was wearing one of Dante's t-shirts. It fell to her mid-thigh, swallowing her completely. For 3 seconds, she stared at the ceiling, momentarily disoriented by the stark white walls. Then the memory of the club, the splintering wood, the blood on the tiles, and Dante's hands crashed over her. She sat up abruptly. Her chest tightened. She took a deep breath, forcing the panic back down into its designated compartmentalized box. She was Chloe Bishop. She organized chaos. She did not succumb to it. She found a pair of sweatpants in the guest dresser that were comically large. She rolled the waistband down 3 times and tied the drawstring as tight as it would go. She washed her face, finger-combed her tangled hair into a messy bun, and walked out of the room. The silence of the penthouse had been replaced by a low, tense murmur of voices. As she rounded the corner into the living area, she stopped. The brutalist living room had been transformed into a war room. 5 men stood around the black granite kitchen island. They were heavy-set, hard-eyed men in rumpled suits, smelling of stale coffee and cheap tobacco. They were Dante's lieutenants, the men who enforced his will on the streets. Chloe knew their names, their payout schedules, and their legal aliases. Dante stood at the head of the island. He was wearing dark jeans and a black Henley, his sleeves pushed up to reveal a sprawling canvas of ink on his forearms. He looked dangerous. He looked like the king of a very dark world. "The Blakes aren't taking meetings," Donovan, a man with a jagged scar across his throat, was saying. He pointed a thick finger at a city map spread across the granite. "They pulled their runners off the south side. They're arming up. Derek is in the ICU with a wired jaw, and old man Blake is screaming about disrespect." "Let him scream," Dante said, his voice flat. "Double the guard on the docks. Anyone moves on our territory, you break their legs. No warnings. Boss, with all due respect." Another lieutenant, a wiry man named Carter, spoke up hesitantly. "This is a heavy escalation. Over a civilian. The commission is going to ask questions." The temperature in the room plummeted. Dante didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. But his stillness was suddenly terrifying. "If anyone on the commission has a question," Dante said the words chipping out like ice, "they can bring it to me personally. And you will never refer to her as a civilian again. Am I clear?" Carter swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the floor. "Crystal, boss." Chloe took a step forward. Her bare foot squeaked slightly on the hardwood. 6 heads snapped in her direction. 5 of the men looked at her with a mixture of surprise, awkwardness, and a newfound cautious respect. They had always treated her politely because she signed their checks. Now they were looking at her as the reason their boss was willing to go to war. Dante's expression shifted instantly. The lethal edge vanished. He stepped away from the island, crossing the room to stand directly in front of her, subtly placing his body between her and his men. "You're awake," he said quietly. "I am." She looked past his shoulder at the maps, the burner phones, the 2 Glocks resting casually next to a bag of coffee beans. The reality of his life, the violence she had always filed away neatly into spreadsheets, was now laid bare on his kitchen counter. "I'm sorry," Dante said, misreading her gaze. He angled his body, trying to block her view of the weapons. "I'll clear them out." "No." The word slipped out before she could stop it. Dante blinked, surprised. Chloe took a breath, straightening her spine. She wasn't going to hide in a guest room while men died because of her. She stepped around Dante, walking right into the middle of the hardened mobsters. The men parted for her instinctively. She looked at the bag of coffee beans, then at the empty high-end espresso machine on the counter. "You have a $2,000 machine, and no one has made a pot yet?" she asked, her tone reverting to her usual office crispness. Donovan scratched the back of his neck, looking intimidated. "Oh, we don't know how to work it, Miss Chloe. Too many buttons. It's a burr grinder, Donovan. It's not a nuclear launch sequence." She grabbed the bag of beans, ripped it open, and began dumping them into the hopper. The men watched her in stunned silence. She was wearing clothes that were 3 sizes too big, standing barefoot in a kitchen full of guns, and she was organizing them just like she did on a Tuesday morning at the office. She hit the power button on the machine, the mechanical hum breaking the tension in the room. She turned back to the map. "You're shifting patrols to the docks," Chloe said, pointing to a red circle Donovan had drawn. "If they pulled their runners from the south side, they aren't going to hit the docks. The Blakes don't fight fair. They go for soft targets to draw you out, logistics shell companies. They'll hit the distribution front on 5th. Donovan stared at her. Carter frowned, looking at the map. "She's right," Carter muttered. "They hit the warehouse, they choke our cash flow without facing our heavy hitters." Dante leaned against the counter next to her. He didn't look at the map. He looked at her. The pride in his eyes was naked and blazing. "Shift the perimeter to the 5th Street warehouse," Dante ordered, never taking his eyes off Chloe. "Let them walk into a trap." Chloe poured the first shot of espresso. Her hands were perfectly steady. The terrified girl from the bathroom was gone. She was adapting. She was surviving. And as she handed the small cup to Dante, their fingers brushing, she realized she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The war room ran on caffeine and cold pizza until mid-afternoon. Chloe sat on a bar stool at the edge of the island, a laptop she had commandeered from Dante's office resting on her knees. She was rerouting funds, pausing scheduled deliveries, and creating legal firewalls around their exposed assets faster than the Blakes could find them. She was deep in a string of offshore accounts when Donovan's burner phone buzzed. It was a harsh plastic rattle against the granite. The low hum of conversation stopped. Donovan picked it up, pressing it to his ear. He didn't speak. He just listened. The scarred skin around his jaw tightened. He lowered the phone. He looked at Dante. Then his eyes flicked quickly to Chloe. It was a micro-expression of pity, but Chloe caught it. A cold spike of dread drove itself directly into her stomach. "What is it?" Dante demanded, sensing the shift in the room immediately. "We got a call from a beat cop on the payroll in the 8th Precinct," Donovan said gruffly. He tapped the screen of the phone, bringing up a multimedia message, and slid it across the island toward Dante. Dante looked at the screen. His jaw locked, the muscles in his neck corded thick and rigid. Slowly, deliberately, he flipped the phone face down. "Clear the room," Dante said. "Boss, we need to counter." I said, "Clear the room." It was a low, guttural growl that belonged to an apex predator. The lieutenants didn't hesitate. They grabbed their jackets and their weapons, filing out of the penthouse in complete silence. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, leaving the massive apartment hollow and suffocatingly quiet. Chloe set the laptop on the counter. Her hands were shaking again. She looked at the back of the black plastic phone. "Dante," she said, her voice tight. "What is it?" Dante walked over to her. He didn't hand her the phone. Instead, he took her hands in his, pulling her gently off the bar stool until she was standing in front of him. "They couldn't find me," Dante said softly. "They couldn't get through the perimeter at the warehouse, so they went looking for the easiest target. My apartment," she whispered. "They kicked the door in 20 minutes ago," Dante said. He kept his grip on her hands, firm, anchoring her. "They tossed the place, looking for you. When they realized you weren't there?" He hesitated, a flash of pure hatred crossing his features. "They torched it. The fire department is putting it out now, but it's gone, Chloe. Everything is gone." Chloe stopped breathing. Her mind went blank. Her apartment, the small, rent-controlled sanctuary she had spent 4 years curating. Her books, her grandmother's quilt, the photographs of her family. Her entire life outside of Dante Gallo was in that building. It was ashes, if she hadn't called him, if he hadn't forced her to come here. She would have been asleep in her bed when the door came off the hinges. She would have burned. Her knees buckled. Dante caught her, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her flush against his chest. He absorbed her weight entirely. She buried her face in his shoulder, gripping handfuls of his shirt. She didn't cry. The shock was too deep, too absolute for tears. It was a violent severing of her past. "I'll buy the building," Dante murmured fiercely into her hair. "I'll buy the block. I'll replace everything. Every single thing they took, I will give back to you 1,000 times over. I don't care about the things—" She choked out, her voice muffled against his chest. "I don't care. It's just, I have nothing else now. This is it. There's no going back." Dante pulled back slightly, framing her face with his large hands. His thumbs stroked her cheekbones. His eyes were burning, completely stripped of their usual guarded armor. "You have me," he said. It wasn't a comfort. It was a vow. A heavy, ironclad chain binding them together in the dark. "You will always have me." Chloe looked up at him. She saw the blood on his knuckles. She smelled the gunpowder and the coffee. She felt the terrifying, unyielding strength of the man who had torn his own world apart just to keep her breathing. She was a civilian no longer. The fire had burned away the line between the secretary and the syndicate. She was standing in the ashes, and the only thing left standing with her was the devil himself. "Okay," she whispered, her voice hardening. The fear receded, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She placed her hands flat against his chest, right over his pounding heart. "Okay." Dante searched her eyes, looking for hesitation, for regret. He found none. He leaned down. It wasn't a fast movement. He gave her every opportunity to pull away, but she didn't move. She tilted her chin up, meeting him halfway. When his lips touched hers, it wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate bruising and heavy with the weight of survival. It tasted like adrenaline and inevitability. Dante groaned a deep, rough sound, his arms wrapping around her waist and lifting her off the floor, crushing her against him as if trying to merge them into a single, untouchable entity. Chloe kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands tangling in his dark hair. She poured all her fear, all her lost life, and all her unspoken devotion into the collision. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing heavily, the silence of the penthouse had changed. It was no longer a waiting room. It was theirs. Dante set her down, slowly resting his forehead against hers. "What do we do now?" Chloe asked, and the "we" hung in the air, permanent and absolute. Dante stepped back. He walked to the kitchen island, picked up one of the heavy black Glocks and checked the magazine. The metal clicked with a deadly finality. He looked at her, the lethal king returning to his throne. "Now," Dante said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "we burn them back." The war did not look like a movie. It did not happen in slow motion, and it did not come with a soundtrack. It looked like sleepless nights, half-eaten takeout cartons, and the low, incessant buzzing of burner phones. For 4 days, the penthouse was the nerve center of a bloodletting. Chloe barely slept. The oversized t-shirt and sweatpants had been replaced by a pair of sharp black slacks and a silk blouse Dante had a courier bring in. The clothes were armor. She sat at the dining table surrounded by 3 monitors, tearing apart the Blake Syndicate's financial infrastructure with surgical precision. She wasn't pulling triggers. She was doing something much worse. She was bleeding them dry. She tracked their shell companies through layers of fabricated LLCs. She found the maritime routing numbers for their imported contraband. With a few keystrokes and a forged authorization code, she rerouted 3 consecutive Blake shipments directly into the waiting arms of federal customs agents. She froze accounts. She cancelled leases on their safe houses under the guise of an aggressive corporate audit. Carter stood by the window watching her work. The wiry lieutenant had stopped looking at her with skepticism on day 2. Now he watched her with a healthy dose of fear. "They missed payroll," Chloe announced, not looking up from her screen. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Dante walked into the room. He smelled of rain exhaust and the sharp metallic tang of copper. His jacket was missing. A thin white bandage was wrapped tightly around his left bicep, a souvenir from a skirmish at the docks 12 hours prior. "Who missed payroll?" Dante asked, pouring a measure of scotch into a heavy glass. "The Blakes, their mid-level muscle." Chloe hit the enter key with a satisfying click. "I bottlenecked the Cayman accounts. The money is sitting in escrow pending a fictitious money laundering review. Their street dealers haven't been paid since Tuesday." Dante paused the glass halfway to his mouth. He looked at Carter. Carter shrugged, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Unpaid men don't fight," Carter noted. "They walk." "They don't just walk," Dante corrected softly. "They panic." He walked over to the table and leaned over Chloe's shoulder. He didn't hover. He simply existed in her space, his physical presence a heavy, grounding anchor. He rested his uninjured hand on the back of her chair. "Old man Blake sent a message through a neutral party an hour ago," Dante said. His voice was gravel, stripped of its usual polish by exhaustion. "He wants a sit-down." Chloe stopped typing. She spun her chair around to face him. "It's a trap." "Of course it is." "Then you aren't going." It wasn't a request. The lieutenants in the room exchanged glances, waiting for the explosion. No one gave Dante Gallo orders. Not his capos, not the commission, and certainly not a woman who was managing his calendar 5 days ago. Dante didn't explode. He looked down at her, a faint, tired smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "I have to go, Chloe. If I refuse a parley, I lose face with the commission. It makes me look weak. Walking into a firing squad doesn't make you look strong. It makes you look dead." She grabbed a tablet from the table and pulled up a city map. "Where is the meet?" "The old tram station on 14th. Chloe's eyes darted across the screen. She zoomed in on the gridded streets. She tapped the screen, pulling up public property records. Her brow furrowed. The station has 3 exits, easy to secure. Dante explained, watching her process the information. Donovan is taking 12 men. We sweep the perimeter. Blake will bring his remaining loyalists. It will be contained. No, it won't. Chloe dragged her finger across the map to a grey block adjacent to the station. Look at this. The lot next door. It's listed as a municipal storage facility. It's been empty for 10 years, Carter chimed in. It was, Chloe countered. But the property tax was paid 3 months ago by a holding company called Apex Logistics. Apex is a subsidiary of the logistics firm Derek Walsh managed. The room went dead silent. Dante leaned closer to the screen. The implications clicked into place instantly. It's not an empty lot. It's a staging ground. If you walk into the tram station, they won't hit you from the inside, Chloe said. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the tablet. They'll trap you inside. They'll use the holding company's property to breach the walls or flood the exits. You'll be pinned. Dante stared at the map. He slowly straightened up. The exhaustion bled out of him, replaced by a terrifying, absolute focus. He looked at Carter. "Call Donovan," Dante ordered. The ice was back in his voice. "Tell him to recall the sweep on the station. We aren't going to the meet." "What's the play, boss?" Carter asked, pulling his phone. "We go to the municipal lot." Dante racked the slide of his weapon. "We burn the trap while they're waiting to spring it." The comms channel was an open line of static. Chloe sat at the dining table. The penthouse was empty. Just her, the hum of the servers, and the heavy earpiece pressed into her ear. The city outside was pitch black, a starless void waiting for the violence to erupt. "Perimeter is set. Apex lot is active. I count 20 thermal signatures inside the main warehouse." Donovan's voice was a harsh whisper through the earpiece. Chloe stared at the blinking dots on her monitor. She had hacked into the municipal grid, pulling the dormant security feeds from the streetlights surrounding the 14th Street corridor. She could see Dante's black SUVs idling like shadows in the alleyways. She pressed the mic button on the table. "Dante, the structural blueprints show a load-bearing weakness on the south wall. If they fortified the doors, don't use them. Go through the brick." "Copy." Dante's voice was terrifyingly calm. "Hold the line, Chloe." 3 minutes passed. The silence was agonizing. It stretched her nerves until they hummed like high-tension wire. She imagined him walking into the dark. She imagined the flash of muzzles. Then the world shattered. A massive explosion rattled the audio feed, followed instantly by the deafening chaotic stutter of automatic gunfire. The red dots on her monitor scrambled. "South wall breached," Carter yelled over the radio. "Push, push! Keep them pinned against the loading dock." Chloe couldn't see the bodies, but she heard the chaos, the screaming, the crunch of boots on broken concrete, the sickening wet thuds that echoed under the gunfire. She forced herself to breathe. She forced herself to watch the street feeds. "Donovan's," Chloe said sharply, her eyes catching a movement on the screen. "You have 2 vehicles approaching from the west. Blake reinforcements. They're trying to flank you through the alley. I see 'em, redirecting fire." The audio dissolved into a mess of shouting and heavy impacts. Chloe gripped the edge of the table. She wasn't an innocent bystander anymore. She was directing traffic in a slaughterhouse. She felt a cold, hard knot form in her chest. She didn't feel guilt. She felt a desperate, primal need for Dante to survive. The gunfire began to taper off. The staccato bursts became sporadic, single shots, then silence. The static hissed in her ear. "Dante," she asked. Her voice cracked, betraying the iron grip she had on her composure. "Nothing." Dante report. 30 seconds of dead air. The silence was heavier than the gunfire. It pressed against her lungs, suffocating her. She stood up her chair, scraping violently against the hardwood. Click. "It's done?" The voice was rough, out of breath, and undeniably his. Chloe closed her eyes, letting out a ragged exhale. The tension snapped, leaving her shaking. Old man Blake is gone. Dante continued over the radio, his words clipped. The Loyalists threw down their weapons. The syndicate is broken. Are you hurt? She asked. No. A heavy pause. We're coming home. Chloe pulled the earpiece out. She dropped it on the keyboard. It was over. The war that had started in a filthy bathroom had ended in a concrete tomb. The Blakes were erased. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights flickered below, indifferent to the blood that had just washed the streets. She crossed her arms, shivering, despite the heat of the apartment. An hour later, the elevator doors chimed. Dante stepped into the penthouse. He was alone. He looked like he had been dragged through hell. His dark clothing was coated in pale brick dust and dark, drying blood. His knuckles were raw. He moved slowly, the adrenaline completely drained from his system. He didn't go to the bar. He didn't check his phone. He walked straight toward her. Chloe turned from the window. She didn't flinch at the blood. She didn't back away. She met him in the center of the room. Dante stopped a foot away from her. He looked down at his hands, then up at her face. The monster was gone. The king was gone. He was just a man hollowed out by violence, seeking the only light left in his world. It's over, he said quietly. I know. She reached up. She didn't use a towel this time. Her bare fingers brushed against his jaw, tracing the edge of the bruise Derek had left days ago. Dante closed his eyes, leaning heavily into her touch. A shudder racked his massive frame. I brought the violence to your door, Chloe, he whispered, his voice cracking. I burned your life down. My life was a waiting room, she replied fiercely. I was organizing other people's chaos because I was too afraid to live my own. You didn't burn it down, Dante. You woke me up. He opened his eyes. The raw, desperate devotion in his gaze was blinding. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his ruined clothes. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her like oxygen. Stay, he breathed against her skin. Not as a secretary, not as a civilian. Stay with me. I'm already here, she said, wrapping her arms around his waist, anchoring him to the earth. I'm not going anywhere. 6 months later, the city had forgotten the name Blake. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the underworld is no different. The territory, the roots, the influence, it had all been absorbed, restructured, and optimized. The meatpacking plant was empty. The dark ammonia-scented basements were a thing of the past. Dante Gallo now operated out of a high-rise office building in the financial district. The glass was still bulletproof, but the view was legitimate. The front companies were watertight. The money was clean, or at least clean enough to withstand a federal audit. It was a Tuesday morning. The rain was drumming a steady, polite rhythm against the glass. Dante sat behind a massive desk of polished mahogany. He wore a tailored navy suit that fit his broad shoulders flawlessly. There was no blood on his knuckles. He was reviewing a contract for a commercial real estate acquisition. The heavy oak doors to his office opened. Chloe walked in. She wasn't carrying a binder, and she wasn't bringing coffee. She wore a tailored crimson suit that commanded the room the second she stepped inside. Her hair was down, falling in dark waves over her shoulders. Carter trailed a step behind her, carrying a leather folio. The Port Authority finalized the permits for the new shipping containers, Chloe said, tossing a flash drive onto Dante's desk. And the union reps agreed to the new pension structure. Donovan is meeting with them at noon to sign. Dante set his pen down. He looked at the flash drive, then leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together over his stomach. A slow, deeply satisfied smile touched his lips. They didn't give you any pushback on the pension? Dante asked. Carter let out a low chuckle. Pushback, boss. She walked into that room, pulled up their embezzled slush fund on the projector, and told them they could either sign the contract or explain the missing $2 million to the IRS. They practically broke their wrists trying to sign fast enough. Dante's smile widened. He looked at Chloe, his eyes dark and thoroughly captivated. "Dismissed Carter?" "Yes, sir." Carter nodded respectfully to Dante, then turned to Chloe. "See you at the briefing, boss." Carter left the room, the heavy doors clicking shut behind him. The silence in the office was comfortable. It was the silence of two people who no longer needed words to understand the architecture of their lives. Chloe walked around the massive desk. Dante reached out, catching her around the waist and pulling her effortlessly onto his lap. She didn't resist. She settled against him, resting her hands on his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart beneath the expensive wool. "You're terrifying," Dante murmured, pressing a kiss to the pulse point on her neck. "I learned from the best," she replied, her fingers playing lightly with the lapel of his jacket. She looked past his shoulder out the window at the sprawling city below. It was a vicious, unforgiving place. It was a city built on secrets, violence, and power. 3 years ago, she had been a ghost in this machine filing paperwork and pretending the blood didn't exist. Now she held the reins. She had taken the chaos and built an empire out of it. Dante's hand moved up his fingers, tangling in her hair, turning her face back toward him. The look in his eyes was the same one he had given her in that filthy club bathroom, possessive, absolute, and fiercely protective. Only now there was no fear left to combat. "Are we secure for the week?" he asked softly against her lips. "Airtight," she answered. "Good." Dante kissed her slow and deep, acclaiming that still sent a shock of heat straight to her core. "Because I'm taking you home, and I don't intend to let you look at a spreadsheet for the next 3 days. Chloe smiled into the kiss. The secretary was dead. The Queen had arrived, and as Dante carried her out of the office, leaving the contracts and the burner phones behind, she knew the city belonged entirely to them. And that concludes the intense, bloody, and beautiful rise of Chloe and Dante. If you loved seeing Chloe transform from a terrified secretary into the ruthless queen of the Gallows Syndicate, you have to hit that like button right now. Share this story with your friends who crave gritty, high-stakes mafia romance where the woman actually runs the show. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our next dark romance drop. Drop a comment below. What was your absolute favorite moment of Chloe stepping into her power? See you in the next video.